Welcome back to Lecture 10, looking at Revelation 14:1 through 16:21. The Lamb standing on Mount Zion and his undefiled followers in 14:1 through 13. As we pan across the arena, from the vantage point of John's optical depiction, shifting our gaze from the sight of the horrendous beast rising from the sea and the earth and their duped and distressed hordes, we are confronted with the hero and his consecrated entourage, 144,000, marked with the Lamb's seal. The Lamb here is not only contrasted with the first beast, which parodied and mimicked its sacrificial wounds. The Lamb is standing defiantly on Mount Zion against the dragon who stood on the seashore. Looking forward, this location of Mount Zion lifts the Lamb above the doomed city of Babylon, condemned to destruction. Resegwe remarks, if chapter 13 is an overview of the conflict between good and evil in this world, chapter 14 provides a glimpse at the resolution of the conflict. The posture of these characters has implications for those who have pledged allegiance to them and have participated in their economies. The refreshing mist of thunderous, worshipful melody which accompanies the saints who are marked by God in 14:2 and 3 contrasts with the billowing smoke of torment choking the devotees of the beast who are marked by its name in 14:11. The adulation for the invincibility of the beast in 13:4 and 8 becomes the evidence for the indictment of the rebellious idolaters in 14:9 through 11. In a stunning turn of events, the bearing of the brunt of persecution perpetrated by the tyranny of the beast has become recognition of loyalty rewarded with rest and position among the blessed in 14:12 to 13. Again, recalling the messages to the churches experiencing the drama of the apocalypse in the cities of Asia Minor, we see here the force of a polyvalent rhetorical message. There is encouragement for those who are persevering in faithfulness and urgent warning for those colluding with the beast. The Lamb and the redeemed on Mount Zion in 14:1 through 5. The opening vista is a bridge section summarizing the themes of the previous section in the conquest of the Lamb and his followers who are worthy to learn the new song, harking back to the Song of Redemption in 5:9 through 10, while also anticipating the upcoming New Exodus procession courting with the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb in 15:3 through 4. The strumming of this song continues to signal a setting of worshipful adoration that contrasts with the worship given to the dragon and its beast. The vision fixes the gaze of John's audience on the heroic Lamb and shapes their sight into glimpses of insight into the characteristics that are desirable for those who would be faithful followers of the Lamb and who would be ushered into the nuptial bliss of receiving the Lamb as Redeemer and Groom in 19:6 through 8. The audience is alerted by the audition of the new song, rumbling like rushing waters and a thunderous clash, that only those who have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb will persist to join the wedding as diners rather than being the dinner, as those in 19:17 to 18 and 21. A choice is being confirmed. Allegiances are being revealed. Destiny is being determined. A line is drawn here in the sands of the arena as roles are being unveiled in the meridian of the final dress rehearsal. The Lamb as God's conqueror. The hero emerges as the Lamb, triumphant and established. The Lamb, the hero who is worthy to receive the scroll from the right hand of the one seated on the heavenly throne, as in Revelation 5:5, because he was slaughtered and as such ransomed a holy people for God, and who comes victorious to judge and make war in 1911, arrives on the scene in vivid contrast to the insurrection of the first beast. Patmore observes, "The Lamb does nothing here but stand, and it is as though his mere presence is enough to defeat the beasts. But the reminder that it was the Lamb's death which secured the people of God in the face of the beast is still fresh." The title Lamb is the most frequent designation for Christ, the agent of divine action in the world, which is parodied and mimicked by the virulent beast usurping authority over the people of the nations. Resegwe summarizes the parallels between the Lamb and the beast as such, and we put this in a chart. So you can see that Christ the Lamb is the one who shares power, authority, and the throne of God. The beast shares power, authority, and the throne of the dragon. Christ the Lamb rules over every tribe, nation, people, and language. The beast rules over every tribe, nation, people, and language. Whole creation will worship the Lamb. The earth dwellers worship the beast. The Lamb is slaughtered and risen. The beast received a mortal wound and is healed. The mark of the Lamb is on the forehead of his followers. The mark of the beast is on the hand or the forehead of its followers. There are many diadems that Christ the Lamb will wear. The beast wears 10 diadems. The Lamb wears a name, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the beast wears blasphemous names on its head. The image of the Lamb, invoking the sacrificial crucifixion of Jesus, is what Friesen calls a paradox, portraying an image that cannot speak for the world of Roman imperialism, with the implication that this image resists the ability for the Roman imperial propaganda to co-opt or corrupt the symbol by what the apocalypse condemns as inherent to the violent and idolatrous empire. We reflected upon the transformational symbolism of Christ as the Lamb that was slaughtered in Lecture 5. We can recall how Richard Bauckham described the transformational dynamic in terms of the contrast between what John initially heard versus what he actually saw, thus morphing traditional, nationalistic, and patriotic symbols of Judean political theology into the theodrama of the apocalypse. Bauckham writes, "The key to John's vision of the slaughtered lamb is to recognize the contrast between what he hears and what he sees. He hears the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, as conquered. The two messianic titles evoke a strongly militaristic and nationalistic image of the Messiah of David as conqueror of the nations, destroying the enemies of God's people. But the image is reinterpreted by what John sees, the Lamb whose sacrificial death has redeemed people from all nations. By juxtaposing the two contrasting images, John has forged a new symbol of conquest by sacrificial death. The messianic hopes evoked in 5:5 are not repudiated. Jesus really is the expected Messiah of David. See Revelation 22:16. But insofar as the latter was associated with military violence and narrow nationalism, it is reinterpreted by the image of the Lamb. The Messiah has certainly won a victory, but he has done so by sacrifice and for the benefit of people from all nations. Thus, the means by which the Davidic Messiah has won his victory is explained by the image of the Lamb, while the significance of the image of the Lamb is now seen to lie in the fact that his sacrificial death was a victory over evil. In his larger study, Bauckham explains even more succinctly. By placing the image of a sacrificial victim alongside those of a military conqueror, John forges a new symbol of conquest by sacrificial death. Jesus, the Messiah, has already defeated evil by sacrificial death. He has won a victory, but by sacrifice, not military conflict, and he has delivered God's people. But they are from all nations, not only Jews. The continuing and ultimate victory of God over evil, which the rest of John's prophecy describes, is the outworking of his decisive victory won on the cross. We can also briefly recall the explanation of Gregory Stevenson when he writes, "With the image of the slaughtered lamb, Revelation subverts worldly notions of power and victory. It asserts that the power of God manifests most profoundly not in machines of war, or in economic prosperity, or in physical security, but in the suffering witness of the cross and in those who take up that pattern. Following Bauckham, and writing from the Anabaptist nonviolent tradition, Loren Johns explains the meaning of the lamb symbolism as the chief image for Christ in Revelation and its ethical implications for the audience. Johns writes, "Central to the lamb Christology of the Apocalypse is the forging of a new understanding of the means by which one conquers, that of consistent, nonviolent resistance born of clear allegiance to God that may well result in death. Thus, the Lamb and his followers gained the victory because of their righteous deeds off the battlefield, not because of their skill in physical combat. The reason the author nowhere narrates an extended conflict or battle between the lamb and the dragon or beasts is because the only real conflict envisioned in the apocalypse are first the one that has already occurred in the death and resurrection of Jesus, or of Christ, and secondly, the ones in which the saints are already engaged through the consistent, nonviolent resistance." Securing his nonviolent interpretation of the apocalypse's lamb imagery and viewing it through the performative lens of witness, Loren Johns concludes his ethical reading as such. The vision of faithfulness to the witness of Jesus includes the witness about Jesus, the witness that leads to suffering and death, and the witness of suffering and death. Through its epideictic rhetoric, the apocalypse challenges the hearing, reading community to enter that vision. It is not a vision designed to make the community passive or to disempower it or to encourage it to withdraw in cloistered existence. It is a vision designed to empower the community to enter the fray with a courageous, nonviolent resistance that may well lead to martyrdom. This sort of resistance is as active as any physical warfare. While rejecting the apocalyptic militancy that called for the literal holy war against Rome, John's message is not, "do not resist." It is, "resist, but by witness and martyrdom, not by violence." The resistance and its militaristic overtones is further fortified by associations with Zion and echoes of holy war in the description of the Lamb's company. As company of the Lamb, secure on the refuge of Mount Zion, the people of God participate in the active warfare of the Lamb's victorious conquest and will share in the just judgments of God on the enemy. Zion as apocalyptic mountain of God's presence. The spatial cosmology of the apocalypse is complex. There is an obvious dualism between heaven and earth. There is the cosmological tier structure of space in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea, in 513, which seems to summarize the totality of the conception within this space. There are more details, to be sure, such as the furnishing of God's throne in heaven, which is at the center of the heavenly temple. The earth is both familiar, inclusive of the real world of the cities of the churches of Asia Minor, and strange, with its permeable boundaries so that the stars can come from heaven and open a shaft to the abyss from which billows smoke to block sun in the sky, as in 9:2. There are some spaces which are initially ambiguous, such as the wilderness into which the heavenly sign of the glorious woman wrapped with the sun and having the moon at her feet and a crown of 12 stars in 12:1 flees after giving birth to the ascendant child and being pursued by the dragon. It becomes clear that this wilderness is located on earth in 12:13, for the earth seemingly personified opens its mouth to drink the great flood pursuing the woman from the dragon. There are other designations which carry explicit symbolic significance, such as the great city that is spiritually called Sodom in Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified, in 11:8. Perhaps most obvious here is the city called Babylon, the seat of failed opposition to God and God's will in John's visions. It is therefore understandable that there are different interpretations of the location of Mount Zion here in 14:1. David Owney perceives an oscillating A-B-A pattern so that the setting shifts from earth, A, to heaven, B, and back to earth, back to A, thus locating Mount Zion on earth. Zion is the traditional moniker for the city of Jerusalem. Comparing John's vision with that found in 4 Ezra, chapter 13, which we'll consider below, Owney concludes that the setting must be on earth. Mounts argues that Zion must be the heavenly Jerusalem, where the new song is sung before the heavenly throne room in 14:4. Resegwe, on the other hand, argues that this Zion is not found on John's physical map, but on his spiritual map, God's mountain, the site of God's presence, and contrasts with Babylon, also located on mountains in 17:9. Ian Boxall agrees, contrasting Zion with both the Jerusalem Temple Mount and the heavenly Jerusalem, but as a place that is nowhere and everywhere, a state of openness toward God and protection by Him. Perhaps we can agree with Smalley, who perceives a blending of heaven and earth with the arrival of the Lamb on Mount Zion. There's no doubt that, in 14:1, John's imagery weaves together a number of dramatic and indeed poetic strands. Mount Zion is accordingly evocative of God's just and protective presence with His people in time as well as in eternity. Heaven and earth are close together in Revelation 14:1-5, and the eschatology of the prophet seer is such that past, present, and future blend as one. Zion, like the temple of God, firmly connects the historical with the timeless and the material with the spiritual. The term Zion is mentioned only in this one place in the Apocalypse. Zion, in the Israelite or Judean tradition, becomes a designation that symbolizes divine presence, divine restoration, and end-time salvation. The metonym of Zion can be shorthand for the restoration of divine presence and the return of Israel's king associated with Jerusalem. In his summary of the Old Testament evidence for Zion traditions, Kim Tan states, "The important organizing concept of the Zion traditions is that Yahweh has chosen to dwell in Jerusalem and exercise His kingship in and through the city. From this important bipolar concept, many strands of these traditions, as evident in the Old Testament, receive their impetus and origin. The inviolability of Zion. Zion as a place of refuge, security, and salvation. Zion as a place of blessing. Zion as a place of pilgrimage of the nations. Zion as the place of universal dominion of Yahweh." With the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in 586 BC, these ideas were not discarded, but were given an eschatological dress. The one preoccupation of the post-exilic prophets was the regathering of the exiles. The future restoration is expected to take place in a glorified Zion. Othmar Kill, a pioneer in the use of iconography to illuminate the study of the biblical text, concurs. He writes succinctly, "Following the downfall of the Davidic monarchy, Zion came to stand increasingly in the post-exilic period for temple and the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, as in Isaiah 18:7. Zion became then an expression of the spiritual and religious political aspects of Jerusalem, particularly when it was associated with messianic understandings of the Davidic kingdom. Thus, we can see here a reaffirmation of the Judean hopes of Davidic messianism, remembering that the Lamb is the arrival of the root of David, Revelation 5:5, coming to fruition in surprising and universalizing ways. Owney, among others, draws attention to the similar traditions joining together the themes of the location of Mount Zion and the coming of the Messiah to defeat the enemies of God's people and execute judgment in the apocalyptic texts of 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch. Carla Sulzbach observes, "In both texts," that is referring to 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch, Jerusalem has become cosmicized and elevated. No longer is it merely God's earthly dwelling. It now emerges with the heavenly divine abode. In later biblical texts, we can detect the beginning of an unrealistic, if poetically beautiful, rescripting of Jerusalem. In those earlier texts, Jerusalem has already expanded to uncanny proportions, has come to life, personified in the guise of a woman, wife, mother, widow, or whore, can reflect or even generate the divine light, or grow dark as it is made to suffer divine abandonment. The process that was begun in the biblical texts is brought to fruition in that the city is now also allowed to transform into or to coalesce with its durable, celestial prototype in a vertical direction. It is important to realize how much the status of the land, the city, and the temple together formed a sacred geography that was intimately connected with the conceptions of the cosmos prevalent in the Second Temple period. This image provided a sense of being in a structured universe. The first parallel is found in the sixth vision for Ezra, the vision that follows the dream about the lion Messiah defeating the eagle of Rome. A dream of Ezra concerning God's chosen man, the regathering of the Assyrian exiles, and the judgment of the nations. So this is 4 Ezra 13, 1 through 58. In this vision, Ezra sees a man arise from the sea and fly with the clouds of heaven, thus echoing the figure of the one like a son of man in Daniel's vision from Daniel 7, 13 to 14. The figure of Ezra's vision is not unlike John's rider on the white horse in Revelation 19, or the fiery testimony of the two witnesses in Revelation 11:5. For Ezra declares that his victory is accomplished through the weapon of his mouth. Wherever he turned his face to look, everything under his gaze trembled, and wherever the voice of his mouth issued forth, all who heard his voice melted as wax melts the fire. Ezra sees an innumerable multitude gathered from all parts of the earth to make war against God's chosen man. The man carves out for himself a great mountain and flies upon it. Ezra is unable to see the place from which the mountain has been carved. Those gathered aim to wage war with the man, standing with a mix of trembling and audacity. When they charge to attack, the armies are reduced to dust and ash as they are consumed by the flaming breath streaming from the mouth of the man. The text reads, "After this I looked, and behold, all who gathered together against him to wage war with him were much afraid, yet dared to fight. And we saw the onrush of the approaching multitude. He neither lifted his hand nor held a sword or weapon of war, but I saw only how he sent forth from his mouth, as it were, a stream of fire, and from his lips a flaming breath, and from his tongue he shot forth a storm of fiery coals. All these were mingled together, the stream of fire and the flaming breath and the great storm, and fell on the onrushing multitude which was prepared to fight, and burned them all up, so that suddenly nothing was seen of the innumerable multitude, but only the dust of ashes and the smell of smoke. When I saw it, I was amazed." Following this, Ezra sees the man descend on the mountain to greet a different multitude, one that is peaceful and who will be recipients of the man's healing power. Ezra awakes from his dream and immediately requests the interpretation of this vision in prayer. He acknowledges that these dreams reveal the events of the end times and that they offer a message of warning for those who will remain until such days. An interpreting angel responds to Ezra, offering both the interpretation of the vision and words of assurance that God will care for those who are left until these terrible events will occur. First, the angel identifies the man. "This is he whom the Most High has been keeping for many ages, through whom he will deliver his creation, and he will direct those who are left." Then, the angel explains why the man does not use tangible weapons, but rather conquers through his incendiary breath. And as for your seeing fiery breath and storm coming out of his mouth, and as for his not holding a spear or weapon of war, yet destroying the onrushing multitude which came to conquer him, this is the pronouncement. Behold, the days are coming when the Most High will deliver those who are on earth, and bewilderment of mind shall come upon those who dwell on the earth. And they shall plan to make war against one another, city against city, place against place, people against people, and kingdom against kingdom. This, it is explained, is a sign that the man, here called the servant, will be revealed. It goes on, and when all the nations hear his voice, every man shall leave his own land, and the warfare that they have against one another, and an innumerable multitude shall be gathered together, as you saw, desiring to conquer him. But he shall stand on the top of Mount Zion, and Zion will come and be made manifest to everybody, prepared and built as you saw the mountain carved without hands. So the man will stand on Mount Zion in order to contest the gathering nations, and Zion is destined to be established by this figure as a beacon of divinely instituted rule. The storm represents the divinely empowered figure reproving the assembled nations in a judicial context, destroying them without effort by law. The peaceable assembly refers to the 9.5 tribes who had been dispersed in the Assyrian exile, thus a new exodus, and return from exile of those long-lost tribes of Israel, and God's protection for Ezra's people in the face of these hostile nations. Here we can see quite similar imagery to John's various visions of the victorious Lamb as God's chief agent of both salvation and judgment for God's people and the hostile nations, respectively. Furthermore, we see the explicit connection with the gathering of a multitude on Mount Zion as a focal point for the end-time climactic events leading to God's judicial decrees, which are portrayed as vanquishing the enemies. Michael Stone summarizes his observations about the imagery of Zion in 4 Ezra by saying the New Jerusalem is connected specifically with the Messianic kingdom. It is pre-created, has a special holiness, and will appear at the end. The second parallel vision for the eschatological Zion comes in 2 Baruch, with another dream and its interpretation about the Messiah and final judgment situated on Mount Zion. So this is 2 Baruch, chapters 36 to 43. The dream and its interpretation follow after a Jeremiah speech to the inhabitants of Jerusalem about the horrors that will befall the holy city. Do not forget Zion, but remember the sorrows of Jerusalem, Baruch pleads. The inhabitants must return to the nourishing wisdom of the Torah, all the more since, after a short time, the building of Zion will be shaken in order to build it again. But that building will not remain, but will again be uprooted after a time, and will remain desolate until that time. And after that, it must be renewed in glory and completed forever. Therefore, we do not have to be saddened so much over the evil that has come now as over that which is yet to be. For there will be greater struggle when these two sorrows, when the Mighty One will renew his creation. Thus, foretelling not only the loss of both Solomon's and the Second Temple, but also the coming days of eschatological tribulation leading to the renewal of creation, Baruch feels the need to withdraw and to seek divine consolation and deeper wisdom. The inhabitants fear being abandoned by God and Baruch, so he assures them, "Far be it from me to abandon you or to withdraw from you. Rather, I will only go to the Holy of Holies and ask of the Mighty One about you and about Zion, if in some ways I should be enlightened further, and after these things I return to you." Baruch does retreat to the rubble where the altar of the sanctuary once stood. Weeping, he lies prostrate and literally cries himself to sleep. While he sleeps, he has a dream of a vast forest surrounded by high mountains, followed by the growing of a vine sourced from a fountain. Suddenly, the fountain begins to gush, and as large waves, it floods the forest and washes away its many trees and levels the mountains, leaving a single cedar tree. Finally, felling even the cedar, the fountain deluges the whole place, followed serenely by the vine, coming to the place where the cedar had stood. Then a confrontation. The text reads, "And they brought the cedar to it, to the vine, which had been cast down. I saw, and see, the vine opened its mouth and spoke and said to that cedar, Are you not the cedar that was left from the forest of wickedness, through whom evil persisted and was wrought all these years, but never goodness? You seized control over what was not yours, and even over what was yours you never showed compassion. You extended your power over those who were far from you, and those who approached you you seized in the nets of your wickedness. You have exalted yourself all the time like no one who could not be uprooted. Now then your time has hastened, and your moment has come. Join then, you too, O cedar, the forest that disappeared before you, and become sand with it, and your dust will be mixed together. Sleep now in sorrow, and rest in torment until your last time will come, in which you will come again and be tormented all the more." With this, Baruch sees the cedar burning and the vine growing and everything that was around it, the plain that was filled with the flowers that do not wither, and awakens from his dream. Immediately, Baruch prays to seek understanding, praising God's Torah as the source of wisdom. Then this divine voice comes with an interpretation akin to the dreams of Daniel. And it says, "Baruch, this is the interpretation of the vision you saw. As you saw that the vast forest that was surrounded by high mountains and steep rocks, this is the word. See, days are coming, and this kingdom will be destroyed that once destroyed Zion, and it will be subjected to the one coming after it. Furthermore, this one too, after a while, will be destroyed. And another, a third, will arise, and it too will rule in its time, and it will be destroyed. And after these a fourth kingdom will rise, whose power is harsher and more evil than those that were before it. And it will rule many times like the forest of the plain, and it will hold fast for some times, and exalt itself more than the cedars of Lebanon. And truth will be hidden in it, and all those who flee to it, who are soiled in iniquity, as evil beasts are fleeing and sneaking into the forest. And when the time of its consummation has drawn near that it should fall, then the beginning of my Messiah will be revealed, which is like the fountain and the vine. And when it is revealed, it will uproot the abundance of its host. And with regard to the tall cedar that you saw, that was left of that forest, and about this that the vine spoke these words to it which you heard, this is the word. The last ruler, who will then be left alive when the multitude of the host will be destroyed, will be bound, and they will take him up to Mount Zion. And my Messiah will reprove him on account of all of his evil deeds, and he will assemble and set before him all the deeds of his host. And after this he will kill him, and he will protect the rest of my people, those found in the place that I have chosen. His rule will stand forever until the world, or perhaps the age, of corruption is completed, until the aforementioned times will be fulfilled. This is your vision, and this is its interpretation." Therefore, we have another roughly contemporaneous vision that links together the turn of the ages, coming of the Messiah figure, the location of Mount Zion, and the final judgment of the oppressor of God's people. Furthermore, just as with the double-edged rhetoric of Revelation's comfort for the afflicted and threat for the accommodating, the divine voice reveals a similar division for Baruch's audience. In response to Baruch's inquiry about when and for whom his vision applies, God reveals, "As to what you said, for whom and for how many will these be? To those who have believed, there will be the aforementioned good, and for those who have scorned, it will be the opposite of these. And as for what you said about those who draw near and those who withdrew, this is the word. Those who formerly subjected themselves, and after that withdrew and mingled themselves with the seed of mixed nations, their time was the former, and it was considered something exalted. And those who formerly did not know, and after that knew life and mingled with the seed of the people set apart, their former time is considered dust. And times will inherit times, and seasons seasons, and one is receiving from the other, and then at the consummation everything will be compared according to the measure of the times, and according to the hours of the seasons. For corruption will take those who belong to it, and life those who belong to it. And the dust will be called, and it will be said to it, Give back that which is not yours, and raise up all that you have preserved until its time. The vision of judgment of the Messiah over the wicked and the oppressive ruler is followed by a vision of separation and bodily resurrection for a consummative judgment. Zion is a pivotal locality dividing those who are condemned with the wicked oppressor and those faithful who are protected and destined for resurrection life. This allows us to return our gaze to the arena of John's vision in order to briefly observe the entourage who accompanies the victorious Lamb standing on the pivotal peak of Zion's unshakable refuge. John sees the Lamb standing on Mount Zion and with 144,000 who are marked on their foreheads with his name and his Father's name. The 144,000, a new song, and consecrated loyalty. Stephen Pattimore writes about the dramatic representation of the Lamb and his people in their intertwined portrayal throughout the book. While the Lamb is the central figure of the visionary passages of the Apocalypse, the majority of references to him have something to do with his people. The relationship between them is described in terms of what he does for them in redemption, salvation, and leadership, their worship and service of him, their companionship with him, and, as a special case of this last, their role as his bride. Conversely, the identity and the task of the people of God are defined in terms of their relationship to the Lamb. Most particularly, it is the sacrificial death of the Lamb, which is both the effective cause of the salvation and victory of the people of God and the model for their own path of discipleship. The identity, life, witness, death, and resurrection of the people of God are defined by their relationship to the Lamb. The accompaniment of the 144,000 recalls the census in interim, that is in chapter 7, of the seal visions of chapters 6 through 8:5. We remember, or we find out here, that the seal on their foreheads is the name of the Lamb and of his Father in 14:1. This is now in direct contrasting parallel with the branding of the inhabitants of the earth with the mark of the beast and the number of its name, and indicates their completeness in contrast to the incompleteness of the beast worshippers and their number 666. These identifying markers are indicative of their respective destinies, determined according to their allegiances and their belonging and identity. Along with this unique identifying mark, the bulk of the description for the vision of this 144,000 is taken up with the audition of a new song in 14 verses 2 through 3, followed by a potpourri of images echoing holy war traditions, nuptial imagery, and allusions to consecrated sacrifice in verses 4 and 5. This depiction presents several features of the 144,000 that we can list as follows. These are, they are with the Lamb. They are 144,000 in number, recalling the census of chapter 7. They are marked on their foreheads with the name of the Lamb and of his Father. They are those who can exclusively learn the new song sung before the throne. They have been redeemed from the earth. They are those who are not defiled with women, and yet they are those who are virgins. They are those who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They are those who have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits for God and for the Lamb. They are those who in their mouth a lie is not found, and they are those who are blameless. Here we will consider how the holy war dressing, the nuptial figuration, and the sacrificial guise are all linked through the concept of consecrated dedication. All of these images meld into a single depiction of a people who are exclusively pledged to the adoration and service of God and the Lamb. The Holy War tradition is evoked here by the conflation of these figures of not being defiled with women and being virgins, with the connotation of chastity or celibacy in relation to the temporary avoidance of sexual intercourse by dedicated soldiers. While some object to the military association of the Holy War tradition on the grounds that it is not made explicit, the ready recognition of the register of the census in chapter 7 for the initial introduction of the 144,000 helps to support the resonance and overtone, as does the broader literary context of the warfare mythos in the vision cycle, as can be seen in the explicit commentary about the Lamb's victory over the enemy in 1714, reminding us that those with him are called and chosen and faithful. We may recall how Richard Bauckham describes the use of violent military imagery in the Apocalypse in order to engage in a nonviolent and spiritual holy war. Bauckham wrote, "By interpreting the militant Messiah and his army, John does not mean simply to set aside Israel's hopes for the eschatological triumph. In the Lamb and his followers, these hopes are both fulfilled and transformed. The Lamb really does conquer, though not by force of arms, and his followers really do share in the victory, though not by violence. The combination of the Lamb and the 144,000 conveys the sense that there is a holy war to be fought, but to be fought and won by sacrificial death. By comparison, Revelation makes lavish use of holy war language while transferring its meaning to non-military means of triumph over evil. Human participation in the eschatological war is not rejected in Revelation, but emphasized and again depicted in terms drawn from the traditions of holy war, which are then carefully reinterpreted in terms of faithful witness to the point of death. The distinctive feature of Revelation seems to be not its repudiation of apocalyptic militarism, but its lavish use of militaristic language in a non-militaristic sense. In the eschatological destruction of evil in Revelation, there is no place for armed violence, but there is ample space of the imagery of armed violence. He is not concerned simply to repudiate apocalyptic militancy, since he shares much of its general outlook. That is, a strong critique of Roman power as antithetical to the rule of God, a perception of religio-political issues within an eschatological and dualistic framework in which God and his people are in conflict with the satanic power and destined in the end to triumph, and a conviction of the need for God's people to engage in the conflict with evil by active resistance to the religio-political claims of Rome and pagan society. Therefore, instead of simply repudiating apocalyptic militancy, he reinterprets it in a Christian sense, taking up its reading of Old Testament prophecy into a specifically Christian reading of the Old Testament. He aims to show that the decisive battle in God's eschatological holy war against all evil, including the powers of Rome, has already been won by the faithful witness and the sacrificial death of Jesus. Christians are called to participate in this holy war and his victory, but by the same means as he employed, bearing the witness of Jesus to the point of martyrdom. It is misleading to describe this as passive resistance. For John, it is as active as any physical warfare, and his use of holy war imagery conveys this need for active engagement in the Lamb's war. Bauckham here speaks like a tour guide in this apocalyptic arena, helping us to see the proper nuance of Revelation's use of violent language and imagery in order to transform it into an active stance. For Bauckham, Revelation does not proffer simply a pacifist ethos, and certainly not a passive one, but a moral imagination where the violence is absorbed into the body of the saints as it was absorbed by the non-retaliatory response of the crucified Jesus. Resistance takes the form of bearing witness and accepting the consequences of martyrdom. This witness is only validated by the truth to which it attests. The martyrdom is only vindicated with the recompense in the martyr's rule with Christ. Paul Middleton explores this theme of martyrdom as warfare even further, but he rejects the idea that participating in death as martyrdom separates Jesus or his followers from violent interaction. Rather, as participants in and contributors to divine violence, martyrdom was an active involvement in an enthusiastic plot to incite divine wrath against their persecutors, in effect forcing God's hand. God judges the world for them to avenge their blood. In this way, according to Middleton, Revelation is part of the seedbed for the radical ethical imagination where actively sought martyrdom was the purest form of true discipleship and imitation of Jesus, and played out in the battlefield of a cosmic war between God and Satan as a contribution to God's eschatological victory over evil. In Christian reflection, says Middleton, martyrs are often described as soldiers or combatants engaged in eschatological battle, which demanded ultimate and single-minded devotion to God. Therefore, Middleton argues, the apparent complete ban on sexual activity, rather than only porneia, is best explained by the narrative John creates, in which faithfulness to God requires radical separation from the activities of the world, which will in turn necessarily result in martyrdom. Furthermore, the martyred Christians represent the bride of the Lamb, Revelation 19, and in order to remain eligible for marriage to him, sexual purity is a necessary precondition. Martyrdom becomes, for Middleton, the controlling concept to bind together the imagery of apocalyptic distress, soldier and holy war rhetoric, cultic purity, and the nuptial fidelity. Reuben Zimmerman, on the other hand, has argued that the conceptual metaphor of marriage is the one dominating and unifying image for a proper understanding of the 144,000 who are not defiled with women and are virgins who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Zimmerman makes the compelling case that this conceptual metaphor of marriage, seen in the contrast between fornication versus nuptial fidelity, is a pervasive structural pattern for the literary work of Revelation as a whole. Kester, who is persuaded by Zimmerman, argues against most commentators who claim that the virgins here must be male virgins. Kester sees a fusion of masculine, feminine, and agricultural images, interpreting the virgins, the Greek word is parthenoi, here as young maidens who are defined by their betrothal to the Lamb. Kester explains, portraying the redeemed as chaste males in 14:4a indicates that they resist the idolatry and sins associated with the whore, but depicting them as chaste females in 14:4b shows that they are prepared to be the bride of the Lamb. Their purity consists of righteous deeds. The basis of the metaphor are the practices of betrothal that were common among Jews, Greeks, and Romans. At the time of betrothal, promises united the couple in an exclusive relationship that was tantamount to marriage. Faith binds people to Jesus, the Lamb, much as the betrothed bride is bound to her bridegroom by solemn commitments. At the present time, believers do not live with the Lamb in the fullest sense, but await the wedding, when they will be raised to life in the new Jerusalem. Zimmerman goes further to suggest that the purity and the ransom imagery are connected to the marriage motif. He writes, on the one hand, virginity and immaculateness are the most basic elements of a bride in early Judaic time. On the other hand, the motif of redemption is associated with the wedding. In this way, marital contracts from the Murabat or from the Babata archive, as well as rabbinical texts, speak explicitly of the obligation to ransom a wife should she be taken prisoner. Ultimately, it is the biblical precedent of Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, which gives Zimmerman his most compelling literary precedent to link together the panoply of images. In both texts, that is Jeremiah and Revelation, the bridal imagery flows seamlessly into harvest imagery. So look at Jeremiah 2. I remember your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of its harvest. Compare Revelation 14:4. Now these are virgins who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were purchased from humankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. This nuptial frame anticipates the explicit celebration of the wedding motif that will be heralded in the announcement of the wedding feast in chapter 19, verses 6 through 9, and the New Jerusalem adorned as the bride of the Lamb in Revelation 21, verses 2 and 9. The sacrificial harvest symbolism is indicated by the term aparche, often translated first fruits. These were the ripe portions of the initial harvest brought to the sanctuary for God as recognition that God is the one who provides, and they were reserved for the priests and the Levites. It was common both to Jewish culture and the broader Hellenistic sensibilities of sacrifice. Auni notes that the term is never used of animal sacrifice in the Septuagint, but only from field harvests, and so must here be used metaphorically to refer to the dedication of the initial offering, which makes the whole harvest ready to be consumed. That they have been ransomed from the land and ransomed from the people of the earth, in 14, verses 3 and then 4, both recalls the song exalting the Lamb in Revelation 5, verses 9 through 10, where it proclaimed his sacrificial priestly role in these terms, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God from every tribe and language and people and nation in 5:9, and also anticipates the marching hymn of Moses and of the Lamb in 15:3 through 4, which declares, all nations will come and worship before you, for your judgments have been revealed. These who are ransomed, in 14 verse 3, and again that verb is used in 14 verse 4, they're ransomed from the earth in verse 3, or out of humanity in verse 4, are the people of God who display characteristics of having no falsehood in their mouths and are being blameless. This is a stark contrast with the economy of the beast who blasphemes in 13:5, and the false prophet in 16:13, and those who speak in deceit and lies throughout the book. The fact that these companions follow the Lamb wherever he goes gives us the paradoxical form of a lamb who is also a messianic shepherd, as was explicitly indicated in 7 verse 17 that said, the Lamb in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and guide them to springs of living water. The specific language that they follow the Lamb wherever he goes also sets up another contrast with the solemn warning concerning the fate of those who follow the beast. Into captivity he will go in 13:10. The double entendre in that warning becomes clearer now as the division of identities and fates between those who belong to the Lamb and those who belong to the beast becomes clearer. The vision of victorious Lamb and his redeemed followers appears in stark contrast to the beast and its followers, and the chorus of angelic voices will now complement the vision with interpretive proclamations and denunciations. The rhetoric of gospel promise and denouncing threat. 14:6 through 13. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza describes the intersection of expansive poetic images with the paranetic function of a rhetorical aim to persuade. She writes, "Revelation is not just a symbolic poetic work, but also a work of visionary rhetoric. While the poetic work seems to create or organize imaginative experience, the rhetorical seeks to persuade or motivate people to act right. Poetry works by representation and is fulfilled in creation, while rhetoric seeks to teach and instigate. Poetry invites imaginative participation, while rhetoric instigates a change of attitude and motivations. Since participation and persuasion, imagination and change are not exclusive of each other, poetic and rhetorical elements can be successfully intertwined in a single work. Revelation is a poetic rhetorical work. It seeks to persuade and motivate by constructing a symbolic universe that invites imaginative participation. The strength of its persuasion for action lies not in the theological reasoning or historical argument of Revelation, but the evocative power of its symbols, as well as in its hortatory, imaginative, emotional language and dramatic movement, which engage the hearer or reader by eliciting reactions, emotions, convictions, and identification." Schussler Fiorenza thus describes Revelation as poetic literature that captures the imagination and rhetorical literature that aims to instigate the audience to a certain kind of ethical practice. Revelation stimulates the emotions as it creatively engages the cognitive intellect. She goes on to describe how John's words of prophecy performed in the midst of the worshiping community to motivate and encourage, not simply as propositional content, but more by creating a new plausibility structure and symbolic universe within the framework of a prophetic pastoral letter. Apocalyptic vision and explicit paranesis have the same function. They provide the vision of an alternative world in order to encourage Christians and to enhance their staying power in the face of persecution and possible execution. The vision of the Lamb and the untainted, loyal 144,000 followers provides an image to orient the ethical vision of John's audience, not only seeking to convince them that this is the right decision, but also seeking to provoke them to stake their lives on it. The vision complements the rhetorical aim of the following angelic announcements, scripting the world into two different camps. Either one worships God or one worships the beast. The audience is compelled to see and hear the arena set before them in John's vision as a participation in the march of the followers of the Lamb wherever he goes, or to be marched into battle behind the beast who is destined to fall. Schussler Fiorenza writes, "The images of eschatological salvation and the heavenly world of God seek to mobilize the reader's emotions, to attract and persuade them to make the right decision here and now, and to live accordingly in this life. At the same time, these passages seek to alienate their audience, their allegiance and affects from the present symbols of Roman power by ascribing to it images of degradation, ugliness, ultimate failure, and defeat." The rhetorical performance of these images and the interpreting announcements not only collapses the distinction between spectators in the audience and actors in the arena, but they align the viewing audience on one side of the conflict or the other. In this theater, those on the stage have encompassed those who sit in the seats. The stage, the logion, has overtaken what the Greeks called the koilon, what the Romans called the cavia. The most sophisticated consideration of this passage from a rhetorical critical perspective comes from the work of David da Silva, who sees in this passage a focal summary of the main points of argument of the whole of the apocalypse. The driving questions coming into view here are: 1, who is worthy of honor and worship? And 2, what is the cost of maintaining that honor by unfailing allegiance. John is guiding the audience to see and to partition the world around them, and thus to accept John's interpretation of their world, even at the most basic level. What is displayed vividly in the iconic representation of the Lamb and his faithful followers resounds in the pronouncements of the following three angelic heralds. De Silva explains, throughout Revelation, but more clearly in these three messages than anywhere else, John forces a choice between the worship of God and the worship of the beast. The focus on the question of whom to worship and why locates Revelation's rhetoric within the context of discussions of justice, that is, dikaiosune, in the Greco-Roman world. Revelation's readers are invited into a deliberative arena as they view the relative advantages and disadvantages of the exclusive worship of the one God over against participation in the cult of the beast. Either choice carries a cost, but it is John's aim to demonstrate, not merely illustrate, that the exclusive worship of the living God is the far more advantageous course. The thrice-fold angelic proclamation is followed by an authoritative paranetic maxim, which functions as a commentary on the previous declarations, and it is then enthused by a heavenly voice announcing the second of 7 blessings. This beatitude is sealed by the explicit voice of the Spirit, promising rest for the faithful martyrs as a reward for their fidelity. Another angel with an eternal gospel. Now verses 6 and 7. The first angel, the first of 7 in this chapter, is seen flying mid-heaven and having an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who are seated upon the earth, even to every nation and tribe and language and people. Here is that message. Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship the one who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water. This message, reverberating in a loud voice, represents the traditional topos of demonstrating proper honor to the divine benefactor, what the Romans called pietas and what the Greeks called eusebia, here transformed by the Judeo-Christian commitment exclusively to the one God. The message is described as an eternal gospel, a brand which recalls the competing propaganda of Roma as the urbs aeterna, that is, the eternal city, and its ideology as decreed in statues, inscriptions, coins, and the Augustan literature. Kester's comments also indicate how this language would have reverberated with connotations of victory in battle, both in the biblical tradition and in imperial discourse. The angel's pronouncement anticipates the fall of the despotic rulers and points to God's rule over the nations, which is the climax of this series of visions. De Silva discusses the rhetorical structure of the argument presented in this proclamation and how the imperatives, fear or revere God, and give him glory, and worship the Creator, are explicated with compelling reasons expressed through causal clauses that indicate the factors motivating the audience. So you have fear or revere God and give him glory because the hour of his judgment has come. Second imperative, worship God. And now we have an implied because God is the Creator who made heaven and earth and the waters. The rationale undergirding the first command invokes the topic of safety or security, which De Silva explains involves adopting some plan or other for ensuing the avoidance of a present or imminent danger. In the symbolic literary world of Revelation, the pronouncement divides the audience into those who are eagerly anticipating this judgment as liberation, like the voices of the martyrs under the altar of the fifth seal in chapter 6, verse 10, dividing them from those who see this day as the coming of terror, like those who are trembling inhabitants, who are dreading the wrath of the Lamb and fearing that they will not be able to stand with the sixth seal in chapter 6, 16 to 17. As De Silva explains, God's commitment to hold human beings accountable in judgment and to mete out rewards and punishments creates a crisis that poses potentially grave danger to all. Acting in a way that shows reverence for God is a path to survival through that crisis. This crisis is the arrival of divine judgment, that is, hekrisis, which is the eschatological reckoning that is akin to what the prophets called the Day of the Lord, and what is deemed in Jewish and Christian tradition as the Day of Judgment. Those who are followers of the Lamb, who are redeemed and considered blameless, welcome that day. Those who follow the beast, worship the dragon and its beasts, and they will dread the announcement, for it portends their destruction. Kester comments, readers who identify with the victims will hear the announcement of judgment as good news because it means that the powers that slay the innocent and ruin the earth will be overthrown. But for those allied with the forces of injustice, the announcement of judgment is a threat because God's actions will bring an end to their dominion. The coming of God is a single event with two opposing outcomes: salvation for the faithful and destruction for those who rebel against God. The second command has an implicit rationale, which appeals to the identity of the God who is to be feared, to receive glory, and whose judgment has come. This is the sole and exclusive creator of all realms. De Silva reminds us that this argument presupposes the vision of the throne room and its hymnic adulation in chapters 4 through 5. De Silva explains, the unstated premise that completes the deduction comes from the universally held conviction that the benefactors, among whom God is supreme, having given to all the ultimate benefactions of life, habitable and fruitful environment, and the like, merit a response of gratitude. Greco-Roman ethicists would concur that God, or the gods, merit worship for their benefactions. The difference being that John makes his claim exclusively on behalf of one God who alone is worthy of worship, and whose beneficence is the gift of life, merits the reciprocal commitment to life, that life in accordance with God's commandments, including the prohibition of worshiping any other would-be deity. The eternal gospel of the first angel confirms that God's rule is just and right, and this is the requisite evaluation for the proclamation that God's judgments are just and righteous. Furthermore, this claim reminds the audience that since God is the creator of the arena, unfolding events are all under divine dominion and must express the sovereignty of God's rule. Another angel denouncing fallen Babylon. The second angel comes on the scene and announces a message of the destruction for Babylon the Great, who has polluted this domain with the wine of her fornication. If the mention of Mount Zion as the location where the Lamb was standing had not fully captured the audience's imagination into the drama of the biblical history, the announcement of Zion's bitter adversary, Babylon, frames the scene as the conflict of mythic proportions. Earlier, in the episode about the two witnesses, we remember in chapter 11, the great city was identified with inimical biblical associations in the likes of Sodom and Egypt, and is assimilated to the place where their Lord was crucified, 11 verse 8. The fuller explanation of the demise of this city will be portrayed by the self-destructive ravaging and immolation of the whore, by the 10-horned beast in chapter 17, verses 16 to 18, and by the conflagration of the fallen and abandoned city memorialized in dirge and hymn in chapter 18 through 19. Thus, we have here in the second angel's pronouncement the first of 6 mentions of Babylon as the seat of opposition to God's rule and the persecutor of God's faithful witnesses. Those mentions are 14:8, 16:19, 17:6, 18 verses 2, 10, and 21. Undoubtedly, we have here in this second angel's statement an allusion to the prophetic tradition that denounced the empire of Babylon that had devastated monarchical Judah and destroyed Solomon's temple in the 6th century before the Common Era. Especially conspicuous are the oracles of Jeremiah and Isaiah. Here is the passage first from Isaiah. "Look, there they come, riders, horsemen in pairs." Then he responded, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods lie shattered on the ground." Isaiah 21:9. Here we can see the explicit association of Babylon's demoralization with the destruction of the city's idols. The double fallen, fallen underscores the tragedy of the city's demise. Jeremiah's oracle, which stands behind the inspiration of much of Revelation 18 and its denunciation of Babylon's influence, to which we shall return in the next lecture, indicts Babylon for its corrupting and corroding effects on the nations, as well as its assaults on Judah. Specifically echoed in the second angel's statement are the following verses. "Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunken. The nations drank of her wine, and so the nations went mad. Suddenly Babylon has fallen and is shattered. Wail for her!" Jeremiah 51:7 and 8. Not only is Babylon condemned for debasing the nations, but the trademark of this destroying mountain that destroys the whole earth is the ravaging of Jerusalem and the diffusion of its idolatrous hubris. In fact, the typology of this angel's declaration reinforces the looming dread of Babylon's termination. De Silva describes it as such. In an important sense, the second angel's assertion is historically true at the time John relays it. Babylon, the Eastern Empire that flourished under Nebuchadnezzar, did indeed fall and lay in ruins. The angel's message itself recontextualizes, that is, incorporates without citing, elements of the phrases from Isaiah 21:9 and Jeremiah 51:7 through 8, prophetic oracles spoken against that historic seat of empire, thus inviting the knowledgeable reader to blend the two horizons of Babylon's exercise of imperialism and its fate, and Rome's imperialism and its prospects. Having committed many of the same crimes as Babylon, Rome will most assuredly fall under the judgment of the same God. Babylon the Great is personified here and denounced as seducing the nations with the wine of her passion, which is her sexual immorality. That wine signifies the intoxicating power of luxury, violence, and false worship. What might have been received as luxurious benefits of colluding with this great city has now been exposed as a toxic elixir spiked with polluting immorality. Again, it is De Silva who elucidates the rhetorical force of the implicit rationality. The description of the central character embeds the rationale for the principal statement. Fornication represents a moral failure recognizable as such by the standards both of Roman imperial Augustan morality and of the Jewish Christian tradition within which John speaks. Babylon emerges here as a contaminant, defiling and unraveling the moral order by her activity. In a moral universe, such contaminants must be purged, such sources of disorder expunged. Rome's arrogance, violence, idolatries, and economic rapine cry out for the inevitable intervention and judgment of a just God, for which Babylon and her fate serve as a remarkable precedent. This personification will, of course, be developed into the full-blown satirical parody, a twisting political cartoon of sorts, slandering the icon of the deified Roma, of Babylon as a drunken brothel whore, intoxicated with the blood of the saints in 17:6, and debasing her colluders with defiling entertainments and extravagant prosperities. The angel's foreshadowing incrimination is the first part of a play on words, where the drinking of this passionate lust, thumos, will give way to the scalding mixture of God's passionate fury, thumos, in 14:10. This is all explained by the pronouncement of a third angel, also calling out in a loud voice. Another angel denouncing the worshippers of the beast, verses 9 through 11. The message of this third angel links together the identities and the fate of the beast and its deluded worshippers as they are exposed to what the inhabitants of the earth decried as their tormenting fear, the wrath of the Lamb, in 6:16. It seems that the very presence of the Lamb and the holy angels is the experience of labored torment for the worshippers of the beast and those who received its mark in 14:11. The angel begins by identifying those who stand in stark contrast to the followers of the Lamb, marked by the name of the Lamb and his Father's name on their head in 4:1, as those who worship the beast and its image and receive the mark on their foreheads or on their hands. Now, verse 9. While the second angel points to the menacing fate of Babylon the Great, this third angel returns our gaze to the immediate foreground of the inhabitants of the earth, who have allied themselves to the dragon's chief agent and the archenemy of the Lamb, who is standing on Mount Zion with his loyal companions. The destruction of Babylon the Great is intertwined with the fate of this rebel alliance by the manner in which the angel describes the destiny of anybody who worships the beast. He himself will also drink from the wine of God's passionate anger, having been poured in undiluted into the cup of God's anger. And he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night, nor those who worship the beast and its image, and if anyone receives the mark of its name. As a bridge passage, both looking back to what has come before and looking forward for fuller explication, the startling imagery here of divine wrath and the torment of the condemned are some of the more memorable portraits of divine retribution in the Apocalypse. However, before one too quickly rejects the Apocalypse as beyond redemption, or too quickly co-opts the passage for some doctrine of post-mortem eternal conscious punishment, it is wise to notice that the singular location expressly intimated here is in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Chapter 14, verse 10. As we glance back, we hear the echoes of the temporal markers that were indicated in the heavenly adoration of the four living creatures singing the Trisagion, Holy, 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 day and night without ceasing. Chapter 4, verse 8. Same temporal framework as verse 3 here. And that was accompanied by the 24 elders falling before the one who lives forever and ever. Chapter 4, verses 9 through 11. Also, this phrase describes the march of time for those who are robed in white, who have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, 7:14, worshiping before the throne of God, day and night in his temple, in 7:15. The eternal activity occurring day and night is the same phrase in all three passages, 4:8, 7:15, and 14:11, thus showing a symmetry of consequence for worship. Bliss in the divine presence for those who delight in the Creator who sits on the throne, but torment in the divine presence for those who resist and direct their worship toward the beast. This contrast is further solidified in the divergence of reward between those who have no rest versus those who rest from their labors. A similar temporal contrast is echoed in the indicated span regarding the dragon who accuses the believers day and night before God. The accusations of the Lamb's faithful will give way to the condemnation of the beast's rebellious ones. Another echo is seen, or smelt, in the fumes of smoke which rise forever, 14:11, recalling the smoke of incense rising in or with the prayers of the saints from the altar standing before God, in chapter 8, verses 3 through 4. The parody of smoke associated with worship, either of the one God or of the beast, offers a multi-sensual signal of the stakes involved in allegiance and complicity in these competing systems of order. This passage also summarily anticipates the coming execution of judgment on both the city of Babylon, which will be served the wine cup of the fury of God's wrath, from 1619, and the legacy of that city as a great heavenly multitude declaim about the blazing spectacle, "The smoke goes up from her forever and ever," in 1903. The fire and sulfur smoldering in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb is a prolepsis of the lake of fire burning with sulfur, which is the destiny of the beasts in 1920, the dragon in 2010, and those standing before the throne to be judged in 20 verse 12. And finally, for death and Hades themselves in 2014. It seems that this imagery confirms the motif that the coming of God is one event with two experiences, and that being in the presence of God is one place with two radically different qualitative encounters, either the celebration of comfort and the communion of the divine life, or the dearth of fiery torment that is the second death. The singularity and simplicity of this divine judgment, while intense and in profusion, is not disproportionate. In fact, if one is adopting John's view of the world, shaped by his vision and informed by the authoritative voices from heaven, then the logical conclusion is to see these judgments as the inevitable outcome of defying the divine order and resisting God's sovereign will over creation. There is a symmetry expressed between, on the one hand, the offense of idolatry and complicity in the violent and exploitive empire, and, on the other hand, the effective outcome of the inevitable consequences. Since there is no escape from the presence of God or from the Lamb, there must be a reckoning in divine judgment. It is Kester who explains it well. Revelation works with the idea of symmetry in judgment. The beast uses violence against the innocent, which is unjust, whereas God makes the perpetrators suffer the consequences of their own destructive tendencies. Symmetry is evident in the metaphor of wine. Since Babylon the whore has made the nations drink the wine of her passionate immorality, she ultimately drinks the wine of God's passionate anger. The wine of Babylon's passionate immorality is the seductive quality of conspicuous consumption and violence, which the nations imbibe. The vision of Babylon will show how those who use violence against others become the victims of violence, and how a society devoted to consumption is eventually consumed. The symmetry continues in the image of fire. Earlier, the beast from the land, or false prophet, did signs in the presence of the beast and the public, calling fire from heaven to lure people into worshiping the beast while slaying those who refused. Now, those who were lured to the beast by fire are engulfed by fire in the presence of the Lamb and the angels. Later, the beast uses fire to destroy Babylon, 1716, making the city's demise a fiery spectacle that others watch, as the smoke of the city's painful suffering goes up forever. Here, the allies of the beast, who bring fiery pain to others, are subjected to the painful suffering in fire, as the angels and the Lamb look on. Those who are appalled at the sight of the idolater's suffering in the presence of the Lamb have chosen a blinkered vantage point of the complete arena of John's symbolic cosmos. In an attempt to corral the Lamb and his followers to be prosecuted as excessive in their violence, commentators seem unaware of their own placement on the docket awaiting the verdict of their own allegiances. This vivid portrayal of divine anger as torment with fire and sulfur and smoke rising into the ages of ages is presented to John's audience as a potent dissuasion from complicity in or compromise with the idolatrous disorder of the beast. The negative imagery reinforces the distinguishing devotional allegiance and the divergent consequences of choosing to align with one side or the other. The call for endurance, promise of blessing in verses 12 and 13. A hermeneutical proposition follows in 14:12. It is not clear whether this is the voice of the third angel or if it is the voice of a narrator speaking out in harmony with the choral of voices of the angelic heralds. The change in topics from the indictment of the idolaters to an exhortation of the faithful suggests the latter, that is, it is the inbreaking of the narrator's voice. The speaker here reinforces the developing argument with a turn toward John's implied audience of Christian believers, interpreting the thrust of the ensuing vision as a parenetic admonition. Here is the patient endurance of the holy ones, the ones who are keeping the commandments of God and the allegiance to Jesus. The interjection here both recalls the previous exclamation in 13:10, which is also an injunction to resist the seduction of the idolatrous prostration to the beast, and the identification of those who are being pursued and persecuted by the dragon, those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus in 12:17. The cumulative force of this maxim is to strengthen the resolve of those refusing to compromise and to discourage those who are cooperating in the economy of the beast. In short, this statement recapitulates the virtues of obedience to God's commands and allegiance to the person of Jesus, while implying that this will be expressed as resistance to what may appear as normal and even expedient circumstances under the regime of the beast. The exhortation is further supported by a voice calling out from heaven with a command to inscribe a paradoxical beatitude, which is confirmed by the blatant affirmation of the Spirit. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on." "Yes," says the Spirit, "so that they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them." The symphony of voices here introduces the second beatitude of the Apocalypse, resounding in a duet between the heavenly voice of the Spirit. The heavenly voice pronounces the ironic blessing on the dead who die in the Lord from now on, and the Spirit explicates the form of the reason for this blessing. One, they will rest from their labors, which are defined as fostering faith and community in the face of opposition. Two, this is because their actions follow with them. This explanation for the description of the blessing will unfold as a flowing wedding gown in the portrait of the saints prepared for the marriage supper of the Lamb in the hymn of chapter 19. In verses 7-8 it reads, "For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. To her it has been granted to be clothed with fine linen, bright and pure, for fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints." The authorial comment here, explaining the wedding gown as the righteous deeds of the saints, also harkens back to the robes washed in the blood of the Lamb, worn by the multitude who emerged from the great tribulation and who sing praise to God and the Lamb in chapter 7. Furthermore, that the righteous deeds follow them beyond their deaths is a comforting guarantee under the prospect of a final judgment. De Silva describes the rhetorical effect of the Beatitude formula as forging certain moral intuitions and advocating for certain behaviors. He writes, "The Macarism, that is the Beatitude, as a form including praise, directs attention to what is valuable and thereby advantageous to acquire for oneself. It carries the implicit potential for exhortation. By declaring a certain class of people to be makarioi, that is, to be blessed, Macarism exerts subtle pressure upon the hearers. The hearers will engage in self-examination to discern whether or not they fit in with the category of people who are thus beatified. If they do fit, they may tacitly recommit themselves to maintain the required behaviors, attitudes, and commitments identified in the Macarism, even if costly. If they do not, they may be pushed to range themselves alongside the category of the beatified and thus to change their behaviors or dispositions. Macarisms continue to punctuate Revelation, holding up certain responses as advantageous or commendable, contributing thus to the overall paradigm of faithful response that John wishes to foster, as well as to the argumentative support for the same. The Macarism in 1413 thus supports Christians in their resistance to the cult of the emperors and its compulsions, holding before their eyes a paradigm of the saints who are blessed, characterized by obedience to God's commands and lifelong loyalty to God and to Jesus as honorable models for imitation and self-identification. Thus, the Beatitude proffers an honest assessment of the cost involved in resisting the allure of the beast's system, that is, suffering and death, as well as the sure incentive for loyal endurance, that is, rest as participation in God's kingdom. The juxtaposition of these blessed dead in the Lord who rest and the tormented idolaters who find no rest in their agony reinforces the contrast between the consequences of the competing commitments and their corresponding conduct. Kester also comments on the rhetorical force of this passage to clarify the choices and to lay out the consequences of practical participation in the conflicting economies which lead to opposite destinies. Kester writes, "This interplay of warning and promise has an important rhetorical function. The specter of judgment in 14 verses 9 through 11 functions as a warning designed to move people to change course and avert judgment. Then the promise of rest in 14:13 functions positively by encouraging hope for the blessing that come through the Lamb. The warning and promise function differently, but both are designed to foster the endurance of the saints, which is the point of this section. The dead who have been allied with the beast have a future with no rest, while those who die in the Lord will be able to rest." Kester explicates here the deliberative rhetorical aim of the apocalypse, to make plain what may be hidden or obscured by the temporal benefits derived from conceding to Rome's exploitive economy. The social advancements that come through participation in common rituals and the seemingly benign traditions of the thriving Roman social order have been exposed as dangerous and disgraceful. As it turns out, the dress rehearsal of John's vision in the arena is itself the unveiling of a true performance in the lives of believers situated in Asia Minor, who themselves refract the light of understanding for all audiences who experience the performance of John the Seer. Either you worship the Lamb, or you have bowed to the beast. Either you are unblemished by pure devotion to the Creator God, or you are stained by the degrading idolatry inspired by the voracious dragon. Either you have been redeemed from the mass of duped and demarcated nations, or you are still being seduced into spending your most priceless assets in the dumpster fire that is this passing age. The great harvests, reaping the ripe earth, and trotting on the winepress of the wrath of God. 14, verses 14 through 20. The shift from the warfare imagery to agricultural sacrificial imagery had already been initiated in the portrait of the followers of the Lamb, who have not defiled themselves with women and have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits. Or, rather, we might say that the blending of images continues as the grape juice implies a sea of blood of vanquished enemies, and the larger section of the vision cycle, more victory chants and battle scenes will yet emerge. Following the angelic heralds announcing the eternal gospel in 14:8, and portraying the judgment of those who worship the beast in 14:9 through 11, the call to endurance in 14:12, and the beatitude uttered in couplet by a heavenly voice and the Spirit in 14:13, comes two scenes of a harvest. A grain harvest, portraying the gathering of the righteous, and a grape harvest, signifying the graphic execution of judgment upon the wicked. While some interpret the harvest imagery here to present a single image of punishing judgment in two scenes, Richard Bauckham has argued compellingly a thesis that concurs with the understanding of these lectures, that the eschatological coming of God is a single event with two divergent outcomes: salvation for the righteous and destruction for the rebellious. It is common to note the influence of Joel 3:13 as a background to the dual harvests of grain and grapes. Joel 3 reads, "Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full, the vats overflow, for their wickedness is great." While in Joel's context, the parallelism seems to represent a single vintage harvest of judgment, it appears as two harvests in John's vision. God sits in judgment in Joel 3:12 as the nations have gathered as an army, back in 3:9 through 10, in the valley of Jehoshaphat in 3:11 through 12, which has become the valley of decision, 3:14, on the day of the Lord. Still, there is a division, for this portends destruction for the nations in 3:13 and signals divine protection for his people in 3:16. The sickle could be used for both grain harvest and a grape harvest. Both harvests typically have multiple phases. Each is harvested, but then the wheat is threshed and winnowed, while the grapes are then crushed in the winepress. Bauckham suggests that the absence of the threshing for the grain, but the representation of the winepress, further differentiates these two parallel harvests. The symbolism of the harvests is traditional for both images of gathering people into the kingdom and for divine judgment on the wicked. The separation of the elect from the wicked is a well-known theme from Jesus' parables. These harvests are parallel in some respects. Both the grain harvest and the grape harvest include a sharp sickle. Both reapers are directed by an angel from the heavenly temple. Both crops are declared to be ripe and ready for harvest. Both reapers thrust their sickles over the earth. The differences will be considered in the details below. The first harvest of the earth, redemption of the faithful, verses 14 to 16. Two issues concern us for understanding the imagery of the grain harvest. Who is the one who is seated on the cloud like a son of humanity in 14:4a? And is this grain harvest an image of redemption or condemnation? The answer to the first question is complicated by a number of factors. Those interpreters who argue that this figure, seated on a cloud, was one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand, must be the exalted Christ, gathering the faithful in his final return, primarily appeal to the antecedent reference to Christ in the epistolary prologue, where the terms of Daniel 7:13 firmly establish the identity of Christ with the image of the cloud and the sobriquet of one like a son of man. However, the tradition of angelomorphic depictions of Christ complicates a simple dichotomy where this figure must either be Christ or an angel. The portrayal of Christ is often fused with angel-like qualities in Revelation and in developing early Christian tradition. Peter Carell can argue vigorously for an identification of this figure with Christ and still conclude that he appears as a seventh angelic figure in a series of seven such figures. And yet, the fact that, one, he is wearing a golden laurel wreath crown, the Stephanos, and secondly, that he receives direction from the imperative of the next angel, and finally, that he performs a function of reaping that is parallel to one explicitly identified as an angel in 14:19, who is also commanded by another angel, causes some to doubt that this figure can be identified with the superior Christ of the Apocalypse. Christ is said to wear many diadems in 19:12 as he approaches to judge and make war with the beast and its allies. The golden laurel wreath crown, the Stephanos, had several functions, but primarily served as a prize for athletic and musical competitions. The diadem was the primary symbol of royal authority in the Greco-Roman world. However, Since the Romans rejected kingship, the Caesars also rejected the diadem in favor of the Stephanos crown to depict ruling authority. Furthermore, it is common to dismiss the direction given to this figure by an angel by saying that the angel is just mediating God's command. So Resegwe can write, "Nothing should be made of a lesser figure directing Christ, for the angel's command are stage directions for the benefit of the hearers or readers." Finally, Bauckham counters the suggestion that the harvester of the collected, that is, redeemed grain could be Christ, while the work of the harvesting the crushed, that is, condemned vintage is merely done by angels. Bauckham points out that the angel merely harvests the grapes, while the work of treading on the winepress is left here unspecified. But it is clearly identified in 1915 as one of the actions of the rider on the white horse. The answer to the second question is also debated, but seems less complicated if we allow for the whole mural of Revelation 14 to be cross-referencing, since John has already signaled sacrificial harvest imagery by referring to the 144,000 as those who have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb in 14:4, followed by contrasting images of those who drink the wine of Babylon's fornication, 14:8. So in the pair of harvest scenes, we see reference to a ready, literally dried grain that is contrasted with a ripe grape, vintage, crushed in the winepress of the wrath of God. The grain harvest scene recalls for those who have ears to hear the depiction in Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse of the sign of the Son of Man who appears in heaven, seen by the mourning tribes of the earth, and seen coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. There, in Matthew 24, the Son of Man will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other, in verses 30 to 31. While there is no explicit mention of harvesting in that saying of Jesus, the Son of Man reference and the conveyance on a cloud make this suggestion more plausible. The second harvest of vintage, condemnation of the rebellious, in verses 17 to 20. Finally, another angel breaches the boundaries of the heavens, descending from the temple, also having a sharp sickle. The angel is accompanied by another angel from the altar, and who has authority over fire. The fire-wielding altar angel directs the angel with the sickle to gather the grape clusters of the vine of the earth, because those grapes are ripe and ready for harvest. As noted above, and considering the billowing smoke of 14:11, there is an implied symmetry here when this scene is recognized as an episode of executing justice. The angel associated with the altar in 8:3-5, and who hurls fire from the altar at the earth in response to the prayers of the saints in 8:4, which include the persistent grumblings of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God, calling out for vindication. It seems they will not have to wait much longer. The fires of the altar, signaled by the billowing smoke, also crackles with the bellowing voices of innocent victims who will not be forgotten in the justice of God. Action will be taken against the wicked, and when it does, the perpetrators of unjust violence will become the victims. After reaping the vintage, the angel threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. A scene all too familiar in the agricultural economies of the Mediterranean insinuates a carnivalesque massacre with the colossal metrics of the fresh and foaming juice. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and the blood flowed out from the winepress up to the bridles of the horses for a distance of about 1,600 stadia. The spectacle moves outside of the great city's walls to the trotting of a winepress that becomes the trampling of a battlefield with an army of horses. Think back to 19 verses 14 and 19. An ancient association between blood and wine facilitates a further blending of the agricultural and military metaphors. The blood of this harvest gushes high and far, reaching the bridles of the mounted steeds and seemingly covering the face of the earth. English translations that calculate an approximation of the distance into modern equivalents, such as the NRSV's "for a distance of about 200 miles," surely miss the symbolic significance of the 1600 stadia. Resegre reasons 1,600 stadia are 4 squared multiple by 10 squared. 4 times 4 times 10 times 10. 4 is the number of the earth or creation, and 10 represents totality. The blood covers the earth completely. The imagery is not only traditional, alluding to the image of divine vanquishing in Isaiah 63:3, but even the proportions have become part of an apocalyptic trope. Jan Feck argues persuasively that, along with Joel 3:13 framework, the imagery from Isaiah 63 is essential to understand the complete account of John's visions. That passage reads, with Israel's covenant God as the speaker here, "I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger, and trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments, and stained all my apparel. I trampled down the peoples in my anger. I made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth." Isaiah 63, verses 3 and 6. Preceding this portion of Isaiah, the destruction of the adversarial nations is contrasted with the protection God promises for Zion in Isaiah 61:1 through 62:12. Greg Beale points out further, in both Isaiah 60 verse 12 and 63 verses 1 through 6, the destruction of the nations is noted immediately after the statement that the gates of the holy city will remain open for the faithful. Bauckham demonstrates that the hyperbolic imagery of the ocean of blood extending up to the horses' bridles is a common topos in apocalyptic portrayals of end-time judgment on the nations. Already in the Epistle of Enoch, that is, 1 Enoch 100, verse 3, there's a picture of horses and chariots wading into a sea of blood. The image is used as well in historical narratives to portray the gory slaughter of battle, as when Josephus describes the massacre of Titus's armies in Jerusalem. The pile of corpses deluged the whole city with blood to such an extent that many fires were extinguished by the gory stream. Josephus writes in the Judean Wars, Book 6. With regard to the challenge of the imagery of violence in Revelation, we can recall our discussion above. The agent who unleashes this ocean of blood is unstated in this passage. As will become clear in chapter 19, the torrent comes as a result of the arrival of the warrior lamb. While this image is distasteful to most, that's precisely the point. Although locating just why a reader reacts so bitterly to the carnage may reveal much about the horizons of their own social location and how they are evaluating the ideological perspective of the seer. Resegwe muses, "The bloodbath is shocking, even barbaric, and it is difficult to ameliorate the disturbing language or to ignore the violence of the vivid imagery. But if the ideological point of view of the chapter is intended to shock readers into reality, then the language is one means to awaken persons to the seriousness of their choices. The intoxicating influence of Babylon is too great to allow ordinary people and Christians to continue conducting business as usual. Spiritual somnolescence is a grave, imperious threat. The offensive language is John's rhetorical maneuver to wake up those who believe that following the Lamb and simultaneously accommodating the beast is a valid choice. Revelation sharpens the choice that all must make. One cannot bear the name of God and the Lamb and the imprint of the beast. Kester extends further the explanation of the symmetrical logic of appropriate retribution here. He comments, "In Revelation, the whole earth is pictured as a vineyard filled with blood. and at least some of this blood has come from the slaughter of the Lamb and the martyrs. Subsequent visions repeat the message that the earth has shed the blood of the prophets, saints, and witnesses to Jesus, as well as countless others. Divine action needs to be taken against the earth because it is full of blood. Instead of drinking the wine, people become the wine. The perpetrators of violence fall victim to it themselves. Previously, the Christian community was trampled by the Gentiles in 11 verse 2. But now this situation is reversed as the ungodly themselves are trampled in 14:20 under divine wrath. The river of blood, which flows as high as the horses' bridles, shows the magnitude of the violence that has been done on the earth. It reveals why divine justice cannot be delayed indefinitely. As Christ tramples the grapes, the amount of blood that is squeezed out shows how full of brutality the world has become. From this perspective, the question is not, why is God's judgment so severe? Rather, if one sees the earth as a vineyard already filled with blood, the question is like that of the martyrs. Why has God not judged the wicked sooner? Learning to ask the right questions is as important as learning to see things in the right way. Aligning one's empathetic sensibilities with the innocent victims and faithful martyrs is like learning how to discern the tune of the Song of the Redeemed. In 14:3, the whole tapestry of this chapter is designed to clarify what is at stake in aligning allegiance with the Lamb over against the beast and identifying with those who are marked with the name of the Lamb and his Father rather than receiving the imprint of the beast. Indeed, it is not only the future destiny of what kind of fire will ascend before God, that of the prayers of the saints worshiping God, or the shrieks of those who experience the presence of the Lamb as an awful torment. The incompatible choices have been sharpened like the angel's sickles, and the destinies have been separated into divergent and opposing ways. That is the conclusion of part 2. This lecture will continue into part 3.